spooky place.
Welcome back to the spooky place, where the stories don't just scare you. They sink their claws into your soul and never let go. Tonight, we don't just tell a scary story, we unleash one. A tale so twisted, so wrong, that once you hear it, it becomes a part of you. It infects your thoughts, slithers beneath your skin, and waits in the silence and the shadows, in the space behind you when you think you're alone. But be warned, this story doesn't end when the fire burns out. It doesn't fade when you stop listening. It follows, it watches, and if you're not careful, it finds you. So go ahead, listen, but don't be surprised if, when the night is at its darkest, you hear something breathing just inches from your ear. The thing under the bed. The boy's name was Ethan, and he was 10 years old. For as long as he could remember, he had been terrified of the monster under his bed. Every night, he would leap from the doorway to his mattress, careful not to let his feet dangle over the edge. His parents dismissed it as a childish fear, but Ethan knew better. He could feel it, the presence, the cold, the dread that seeped up from the darkness beneath him. One night, as he lay trembling under his blanket, he heard it, a voice, soft and trembling, like a child's whisper. Check under the bed. I'm lonely. Ethan froze. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure the thing beneath him could hear it. The voice wasn't menacing or growling like he'd always imagined. It sounded sad, desperate, and somehow that made it worse. For hours, he lay there, clutching his blanket, too afraid to move. But the voice kept calling, growing softer and more pitiful with each passing minute. Finally, driven by a mix of curiosity and a strange, inexplicable pity, Ethan mustered his courage. He slid to the edge of the bed, his hands shaking, and peered over the side. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, crouched in the shadows, was a boy. But it wasn't just any boy, it was him. A pale, wide-eyed version of himself, with hollow cheeks and a trembling mouth. The boy's eyes locked onto Ethan's, and he whispered, "There's someone on top of the bed." Ethan jerked back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He scrambled to the far side of the mattress, his eyes darting around the room. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the walls were closing in. He wanted to scream, to call for his parents, but his voice caught in his throat. Then he heard it, a creak, the sound of the bed frame shifting, as if someone or something was moving on top of it. Ethan's eyes widened as he felt the mattress dip slightly, as though a weight had settled just behind him. He didn't dare turn around. He couldn't. The voice from under the bed spoke again, trembling and urgent. "Don't look. Don't move. It's watching you." Ethan's mind raced. What was happening? Was he dreaming? Hallucinating? He squeezed his eyes shut, praying that when he opened them, everything would be normal. But when he finally dared to peek, the room was darker than before. The moonlight streaming through the window seemed dimmer, the shadows deeper. And then he felt it, a cold breath on the back of his neck. He screamed, leaping off the bed and bolting for the door. But as he reached for the handle, the door slammed shut on its own. Ethan yanked at it, but it wouldn't budge. He turned, pressing his back against the wood, his chest heaving. The room was silent now, too silent. The air was thick, oppressive, and the shadows seemed to pulse and writhe like living things. Ethan's eyes darted to the bed. The pale version of himself was gone, but something else was there now. A dark, shapeless mass crouched on the mattress, its form shifting and twisting unnaturally. It had no face, no eyes, but Ethan could feel its gaze piercing through him. "You shouldn't have looked," the voice from under the bed whispered, now coming from all around him. "Now it knows you're here." The mass on the bed began to move, sliding off the mattress with a sickening, liquid sound. Ethan's legs gave out, and he sank to the floor, paralyzed with terror. The thing oozed toward him, its form constantly changing. A tangle of limbs, a gaping maw, a pair of glowing, hateful eyes. Just as it reached him, the voice from under the bed screamed, "Close your eyes." Ethan obeyed, squeezing his eyes shut as tightly as he could. He felt the cold presence of the thing inches from his face, its breath like ice against his skin. He braced himself for the end, for the pain, for the darkness. But nothing happened. When he finally opened his eyes, the room was empty. The bed was just a bed, the shadows were just shadows, and the door was slightly ajar. Ethan stumbled to his feet, his legs trembling, and ran to his parents' room. They were asleep, undisturbed. He shook his mother awake, sobbing, but when she asked him what was wrong, he couldn't bring himself to explain. How could he? It sounded insane. The next night, Ethan refused to sleep in his room. His parents, exasperated but sympathetic, let him sleep on the couch. For a while, things seemed normal. But as the weeks passed, Ethan began to notice strange things. His reflection in the mirror sometimes moved when he didn't. His shadow seemed to linger a second too long after he walked away. And at night, no matter where he slept, he would hear the whisper, check under the bed, "I'm lonely." One night, unable to resist, Ethan finally looked under the couch. There, staring back at him, was the pale, wide-eyed version of himself. But this time the boy smiled, a cold, hollow smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You can't run forever," the boy whispered. "It's coming for you, and when it finds you, I'll finally be free." Ethan slammed his eyes shut, but was too late. He felt the cold breath on his neck again, and he knew the thing was back, and this time, it wasn't going to let him go. Ethan's life became a nightmare. No matter where he slept, the couch, the guest room, even the floor of his parents' bedroom, the whispers followed him. The pale version of himself would appear, sometimes under the bed, sometimes in the closet, sometimes just standing in the corner of the room, staring at him with those hollow, desperate eyes. And always the same warning, "It's coming. It's coming for you." The thing, the dark, shapeless mass, was never far behind. Ethan would catch glimpses of it in the shadows, hear its wet, slithering movements just out of sight. It never attacked, never touched him, but its presence was constant, suffocating. It was playing with him, he realized, toying with him, waiting. Ethan's parents grew increasingly worried. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped speaking. He spent his days locked in his room, the curtains drawn, the lights on. He refused to explain what was wrong, and when they pressed him, he would only whisper, "It's coming." One night, desperate for answers, Ethan's father decided to sleep in his son's room. He thought it would reassure Ethan, prove that there was nothing to fear. But when Ethan woke in the middle of the night, his father was gone. The bed was empty, the sheets cold. Ethan called for him, his voice trembling, but there was no response. Then he heard it, a faint, muffled sound coming from under the bed. His heart stopped. He knew he shouldn't look, knew it was a trap, but he couldn't help himself. He slid to the edge of the mattress and peered over the side. His father was there, but it wasn't his father, not really. The man's face was twisted in a grotesque parody of fear, his eyes wide and unseeing, his mouth stretched in a silent scream. His body was contorted, folded unnaturally to fit beneath the bed, and beside him, crouched in the shadows, was the pale version of Ethan, grinning that that same cold, hollow grin. "It's too late," the boy whispered. "It's already taken him, and soon it will take you too." Ethan screamed, scrambling back onto the bed. He wanted to run, to hide, to do anything to escape the horror, but he was trapped. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing closer, the shadows deepening. And then he felt it, the cold breath on the back of his neck. He spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty room, the silent darkness. But he knew the thing was close. He could feel it, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, Ethan's mother found him huddled in the corner of the room, his eyes wide and unblinking, his body trembling. She tried to comfort him, but he pushed her away, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's coming. It's coming for me." She didn't understand. How could she? But she knew something was terribly wrong. She called a doctor, the police, even a priest, but no one could help. Ethan's father was gone, vanished without a trace, and Ethan was slipping further and further into madness. That night, Ethan's mother decided to stay with him. She refused to leave his side, determined to protect him from whatever was tormenting him. But as the hours passed, she began to feel it too. The cold, the dread, the sense of being watched. She tried to ignore it, to stay strong for her son, but the fear was overwhelming. Then she heard it, the whisper, soft, trembling, like a child's voice. "Check under the bed. I'm lonely." She froze, her heart pounding. She looked at Ethan, but he was already staring at her, his eyes wide with terror. "Don't," he whispered. "Please don't look." But she had to. She couldn't help herself. She slid to the edge of the bed and peered over the side. What she saw made her blood run cold. There, crouched in the shadows, was Ethan. But it wasn't Ethan. Not really. It was the pale, wide-eyed version of him, grinning that same cold, hollow grin. And beside him, contorted and broken, was her husband. "It's too late," the boy whispered. "It's already taken him, and soon it will take you too." Ethan's mother screamed, scrambling back on the bed. She grabbed her son, holding him tightly, as if she could protect him from the horror. But she knew it was no use. The thing was already there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And then she felt it, the cold breath on the back of her neck. The next morning, the house was silent. Ethan's mother was gone, vanished like his father. Ethan was alone, huddled in the corner of the room, his eyes wide and unblinking, his body trembling. He knew it was only a matter of time before the thing came for him. But as the days passed, something strange happened. The whispers stopped. The pale version of himself disappeared. The thing, the dark, shapeless mass, was gone. Ethan was alone, truly alone, for the first time in weeks. At first, he thought it was over. He thought he was safe, but then he began to notice the changes. His reflection in the mirror didn't move when he did. His shadow lingered a second too long after he walked away. And at night, no matter where he slept, he would hear the whisper, "Check under the bed. I'm lonely." One night, unable to resist, Ethan finally looked, and there, crouched in the shadows, was the pale, wide-eyed version of himself. But this time, the boy wasn't alone. Beside him, contorted and broken, were his parents. "It's too late," the boy whispered. "It's already taken them, and soon it will take you too." Ethan screamed, but no sound came out. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was trapped, paralyzed, as the thing, the dark, shapeless mass, oozed out from under the bed, its form shifting and twisting unnaturally. And then he felt it, the cold breath on the back of his neck. The next morning, the house was silent. Ethan was gone, vanished like his parents. But if you listen closely on a quiet night, You might hear the whisper, "Check under the bed. I'm lonely." And if you're foolish enough to look, you might see him, the pale, wide-eyed version of Ethan, grinning that same cold, hollow grin. And beside him, contorted and broken, will be you, because the thing is always hungry, and it's always waiting. Years passed, and the house where Ethan and his family once lived stood abandoned, a hollow shell of its former self. The neighbors whispered about the tragedy, about the boy who vanished, about the parents who disappeared without a trace. They said the house was cursed, that something dark and ancient lived within its walls. No one dared to enter, not even the bravest of souls. But sometimes, on quiet, moonless nights, the faint sound of a child's whisper could be heard drifting from the broken windows. "Check under the bed. I'm lonely." One day, a new family moved in. They were unaware of the house's grim history, lured by the low price and the spacious rooms. The parents laughed off the rumors, dismissing them as silly superstitions. But their young daughter, Lily, felt at the moment she stepped inside, the cold, the dread, the sense of being watched. That night, as she lay in her new bed, she heard it, the whisper, soft, trembling, like a child's voice. "Check under the bed. I'm lonely." Her heart raced, but she told herself it was just her imagination. She closed her eyes, trying to ignore it, but the whisper grew louder, more insistent, until she couldn't resist. She slid to the edge of the bed and peered over the side. There, crouched in the shadows, was a pale, wide-eyed boy. He looked just like the photos she'd seen in the attic earlier that day. Photos of a family that had once lived here. The boy grinned, his hollow eyes locking onto hers. "There's someone on top of the bed," he whispered. And as Lily felt the cold breath on the back of her neck, she realized the cycle had begun again. The thing was still there, still hungry, still waiting, and it would never stop. Lily's parents found her the next morning, huddled in the corner of the room, her eyes wide and unblinking, her body trembling. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep. When they asked her what was wrong, she only whispered, "It's coming." They tried to comfort her, to reassure her, but they didn't understand. How could they? They hadn't seen what she had seen. They hadn't felt the cold breath on their necks, hadn't heard the whispers in the dark. But as the days passed, they began to feel it too. The dread, the sense of being watched. And one night, as they lay in bed, they heard it, the whisper, soft, trembling, like a child's voice. "Check under the bed. I'm lonely." They knew then that the house was alive, that it was hungry, and that it would never let them go. The thing under the bed had claimed another family, and it would keep claiming them, one by one, until there was no one left to whisper to. Years later, the house still stands, silent and foreboding, its windows dark and its doors sealed shut. The neighborhood children dare each other to approach it, to touch its rotting porch, or peer through its cracked glass. But no one ever stays long. They feel it, the cold, the dread, the whispers that seem to echo from deep within its walls. And if they linger too close at night, they might hear it, the faint, trembling voice of a child calling out from the shadows. "Check under the bed. I'm lonely." Some say the house is cursed, that it feeds on fear and despair. Others believe it's a gateway, a place where something ancient and hungry waits, forever reaching out from the darkness. But one thing is certain, the thing under the bed is still there, still waiting, still whispering, and it will never stop, not until every soul has been claimed, and the world above is as empty and cold as the void below. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.